Random House Audiobooks presents The Far Side of the World by Patrick O'Brien. Read for you by Tim Pigott-Smith.
The Far Side of the World. Pass the word for Captain Aubrey. Pass the word for Captain Aubrey, cried a sequence of voices, at first dim and muffled far aft on the flagship's main deck, then growing louder and more distinct as the call wafted up to the quarterdeck, and so along the gangway to the forecastle, where Captain Aubrey stood by the starboard 32-pounder carronade, contemplating the Emperor of Morocco's purple galley as it lay off Jumper's Bastion, with the vast grey and tawny rock of Gibraltar soaring behind it, while Mr. Blake, once a puny member of his midshipman's berth, but now a tall, stout lieutenant, almost as massive as his former captain, explained the new carriage he had invented, a carriage that should enable carronades to fire twice as fast, with no fear of oversetting, twice as far, and with perfect accuracy, thus virtually putting an end to war. Only a flag officer could pass the word for a post captain, and Jack Aubrey had been dreading the summons ever since the Caledonia came in. He would have to tell the Commander-in-Chief how it came about that his orders had not been obeyed. Seeing that Aubrey's small, elderly but sweet-sailing frigate Surprise was to return from Malta to England, there to be laid up, or sold out of the service, or even sent to the breaker's yard, Admiral Sir Francis Ives, the Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean, had directed him to go by way of Zambra on the Barbary coast, there to reason with the Dey of Mascara, the ruler of those parts, who showed a tendency to side with the French, and who had uttered threats of hostile action if he were not given an enormous sum of money. If the Dey proved stubborn, Aubrey was to embark the British consul, and to tell His Highness that the instant any of these threats were carried into action, all ships bearing the Mascarene flag should be seized, burnt, sunk, or otherwise destroyed, and the Dey's ports blocked up. Aubrey was to sail in company with the Pollux, an even older 60-gun ship that was carrying Rear Admiral Hart back to England as a passenger, but the mission to the Dey was his alone, and having accomplished it, he was to report to the Commander-in-Chief at Gibraltar. It seemed to him a fairly straightforward assignment, particularly as he had an unusually well-qualified political adviser in his surgeon, Dr. Maturin, and off the mouth of Zambra Bay he left the Pollux with an easy mind. But they had been betrayed. The Commander-in-Chief's plan had become known to the enemy, and a French ship of the line, together with 2 frigates, appeared in evident collusion with the Mascarenes. The Dey's forts had fired on the Surprise, and in the subsequent activity Aubrey had neither had an interview with the ruler nor embarked Mr. Consul Elliot. The Pollux, closely engaged by the French 80-gun ship, had blown up with the loss of all hands, and although by her brilliant sailing qualities the Surprise had run clear, Jack Aubrey had in fact accomplished nothing of what he had been sent to do. To be sure, he could represent that he had wrecked a heavy French frigate by luring her over a reef, and that the Pollux had so mauled her adversary in the fight, and had so shattered her in blowing up, that there was little likelihood of her ever regaining Toulon. But he had nothing tangible to show, and although he was satisfied in his own mind that materially the Royal Navy had gained rather than lost by the encounter, he was by no means sure that the Commander-in-Chief would see it in the same light. Sir Francis had an alarming reputation, not only as a rigid disciplinarian and a right Tartar, but also as one who would break an erring subordinate without compunction. How the Zambra action would appear in this respect, Jack could not decide. "Another couple of minutes will tell me, however," he said to himself, as he hurried aft in the wake of a nervous youngster. But he was mistaken. The call had originated in the other flag officer aboard, the captain of the fleet, who was confined to his cabin by the present bout of influenza, but who wished Jack to know that his wife had taken a house no great way from Ashgrove Cottage, and that she should be very happy to make Mrs. Aubrey's acquaintance. Their children were much of the same age, he said. During this time, the Commander-in-Chief, Sir Francis Ives himself, carried on with what was left of his paperwork. The two clerks kept their pens plying fast, the one on a fair copy of the previous letter, the other on a rough of this. The other inhabitants of the great cabin were Mr. Yarrow, the Admiral's secretary, and Mr. Pocock, his political adviser. Mr. Pocock, stepping over to the stern galley, said, "Bless me, the Emperor's envoy has put off already." "God damn and blast the man!" cried the Admiral, looking angrily at the clock. "I shall not have time for Aubrey. Pray tell him so, Mr. Yarrow. Make my excuses, force majeure, do the civil thing, bid him to dinner, and let him bring Dr. Maturin, or, let them come tomorrow morning, if that don't suit." It did not suit. Aubrey was infinitely concerned, but it was not in his power to dine with the Commander-in-Chief today. He was already engaged to a lady. At Jack's first words to Mr. Yarrow, the captain of the fleet's eyebrows shot up under his nightcap. At his last, the only excuse that in a naval context could acquit him of being a wicked, contumelious, discontented, froward, mutinous dog, the eyebrows reappeared in their usual place, and the captain of the fleet said, "I wish I were engaged to dine with a lady. I've not seen one, apart from the boatswain's wife, since Malta. There's something wonderfully comfortable about having a lady's legs under one's table, Aubrey." In principle, Aubrey was all agreement. By land, he was quite devoted to women. Indeed, his devotion had very nearly been his undoing before this, and he dearly loved to have their legs under his table. But in the case of these particular legs, an uncommonly elegant pair, and of this particular dinner, his mind was far from easy. In fact, uneasiness of one sort or another fairly crammed his mind today, leaving little room for its usual cheerfulness. He had given Laura Fielding, the lady in question, a lift from Valletta to Gibraltar, and in ordinary circumstances it was a perfectly usual thing to carry a fellow officer's wife from one port to another. These circumstances, however, were very far from ordinary. Mrs. Fielding, an Italian lady with dark red hair, had appeared in the middle of a midnight downpour with no baggage under the protection of Stephen Maturin, who offered no explanation of her presence, only observing that in Captain Aubrey's name he had promised her a passage to Gibraltar. Jack knew very well that his intimate friend Maturin was deeply concerned with naval and political intelligence, and he asked no questions, accepting the situation as a necessary evil, but as a very considerable evil, since rumour had connected Jack's name with Laura's at a time when her husband was a prisoner of war in the hands of the French. Yet in this instance rumour was mistaken. Nevertheless, the rumour had reached the Adriatic, and there the escaping husband, Lieutenant Charles Fielding of the Navy, had met it aboard HMS Nymph, and, being of an intensely jealous nature, had believed it at once. He had followed the surprise to Gibraltar, landing the night before. On hearing the news, Jack had at once sent the pair an invitation to dinner the next day. But in spite of Laura's kind note of acceptance, he was by no means convinced that he might not have an exceedingly awkward situation on his hands at 2:30 when he was to receive his guests at Reed's Hotel. Landing at the Ragged Staff a little before noon, he sent his barge back to the Surprise, with very unnecessarily repeated instructions to his coxswain about the promptitude of those hands who were to assist at the dinner. For the Navy, though often reduced to salt horse and hard tack, ate it in style, every officer and guest having a servant behind his chair, a style that few hotels could equal. Then, observing that the parade was almost empty, he walked along towards the Alameda Gardens, meaning to sit on the bench under the dragon tree. He did not choose to return to his ship at present, for not only was it painful to him to see her, knowing that she was condemned, but in spite of his efforts the news of her fate had spread, and sadness with it, so that the joyful surprise...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?